This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. Go to the link in the description below so they know that I sent you. Hello everyone, I'm Nita Hone, and it is Friday, so that means it's time for another MTG Top 10. This week we are looking at a creature type, Drakes. I'm interested in looking at this one because there are a preponderance of Drakes seeing play in Standard right now, enough that there's even a deck called Is It Drakes? I was curious to see where these newer Drakes rank compared to those from the games past. To be eligible for this video, a card had to either have the Drake creature type or create Drake creature tokens. In all, there were 90 cards that met those qualifications, and in this video, we'll talk about the 10 that have had the biggest impact on competitive Magic. Before we get started, a quick reminder on how I score cards for these videos. Pro Tour and Mythic Championship top 8s, as well as Legacy and Vintage Championship top 8s are worth 2 points, and a Grand Prix top 8 is worth 1 point. Before we get started with number 10 this time around, there is an honorable mention that technically has 0 points from the way that I score cards, but it's had a big impact on one of Magic's most popular formats, so let's talk about it first. In that honorable mention is Peregrine Drake, a card that was so dominant in Pauper that it had to be banned in November of 2016. The funny thing is that Peregrine Drake wasn't even originally legal in Pauper. Its printing from Urza Saga in 1998 was at Uncommon. However, in June of 2016, Wizards printed the Drake at Common in Eternal Masters, something that has to be the biggest mistake Wizards has made so far in terms of downshifting rarity to make a card legal in Pauper. The Drake is part of a cycle of cards in Urza's block that are essentially free because they untap a number of lands equal to their converted mana cost when they come into play. This can allow some absurd combos, even in a format like Pauper where all the cards have to be common. The Drake came to dominate the format because there were infinite mana combos involving flicker effects and mnemonic wall, and it also worked quite well in conjunction with the Tron lands. So, in the end, just 6 months after being printed at Common for the first time, Peregrine Drake got banned in the format, and it's probably not going to ever return. Alright, so that's our honorable mention. Let's move to number 10. At number 10, we have an enchantment that makes Drake tokens, and that's Drakehaven. This was one of my favorite cards to play with in Amonkhet Limited. It's a pretty sweet cycling or discard build around, as adding a 2/2 to the battlefield for 1 mana every time you do one of those things is quite powerful. It proved to even be strong enough for Standard, putting up a single Grand Prix top 8 in a blue-white cycling deck where Drakehaven was the main win condition. While right now it only has the 1 point, I feel like this is the kind of card that if given the right kind of support in the future, could find its way into non-rotating formats. At number 9, we have Stitch Drake, a zombie Drake. As a 3-mana 3/4 with flying, it provides some pretty good stats that are just enough to help it dodge removal that does 3 damage, which is ubiquitous in Standard formats. The catch here is that you have to have a creature card in your graveyard or you just can't cast this Drake. Like Drakehaven, it only managed a single Grand Prix top 8, in this case back in 2012, in a blue-white aggro deck. Unlike Drakehaven, which I think has some potential in the future, Stitch Drake probably won't be adding on to its score without a standard legal reprint. At number 8 is Uktabi Drake, the only card on this list that isn't at least partly blue. Uktabi Drake provides some amazing stats as a 1-mana 2/1 with flying and haste, but the catch here is the echo cost you have to pay on your next turn, which means, in the end, if you want to keep it in play, you are paying a total of 4 mana. It picked up its only point at Grand Prix Florence in 2007, a Time Spiral block Grand Prix. This deck was a red-green aggro deck that sought to use Haze of Rage to win the game. This deck didn't really plan on keeping Uktabi Drakes in play for the next turn. It intended to use them to up the storm count with ease, and then drop a Haze of Rage and then attack with your Drakes. This was Uktabi Drake's moment in the spotlight, and it probably won't be having another one anytime soon. At number 7, we have a merfolk who makes Drake tokens, and that is, of course, Talrand, Sky Summoner. Talrand is powerful in decks that can reliably get his triggered ability going. Such decks are generally able to protect Talrand with counter magic, while clogging up the skies with Drakes who can go for the win. Talrand saw play in standard blue-white control decks that were filled to the brim with good instants and sorceries, as well as other cards that like those card types, like Augur of Bolas, Runechanter's Pike, and Snapcaster Mage. Talrand is expensive and vulnerable, and as a result has never seen play in non-rotating formats. At number 6, we have Spiketail Hatchling, a young Drake that is willing to sacrifice itself for the cause in order to force spike something. A card like this is particularly annoying for people to play against because it essentially makes them wait a turn to cast their more powerful spells, especially if you play this on turn 2, and in the meantime, the Hatchling can be attacking away in the sky. Spiketail Hatchling managed 2 Pro Tour top 8s in the Standard of 2000 and 2001. One of them came in a mono blue deck that was loaded up with flyers and counter magic, and Spiketail Hatchling was the only card in the deck that could do both. The other top 8 came in an opposition deck, a deck that made really effective use of the Hatchling because it liked to lock down the opponent's mana with opposition and static orb, and if you had a Hatchling in play while you were doing that, it was going to be even harder for your opponent to successfully cast a spell. At number 5, we have Enigma Drake, the first of 3 Drakes on this list that are currently in Standard. Like the other Drakes seeing play in Standard right now, Enigma Drake likes instants and sorceries and can get quite large in a hurry in a deck that runs a bunch of cheap cantrips and removal spells, and that's where it sees play, in some versions of the Is It Drakes deck, which is essentially a blue-red spells deck where several of the payoffs happen to be Drakes. It hasn't put up any points since 2018 though, and isn't seeing quite as much play in current versions of the deck, so this may be where it stays for a while. At number 4, we have another Hatchling in Drake Hatchling. This is the kind of card that illustrates the power creep that we've seen in creatures over the years. Drake Hatchling would be a fine common in a limited format today. I would probably give it a C or a C+ in a set review, but there's basically no way that a 3-mana 1/3 with flying and the ability to pump its power once a turn would see play in Constructed. However, back in 2000, it was good enough for both block and Standard. In Mask's block, it saw play in mono blue decks that sought to stall out the game with counter magic and rising waters and slowly kill the opponent with the Drake's flying damage. In Standard, it saw play alongside Spiketail Hatchling in the mono blue Flyers deck. At number 3, we have Pteramander, another Drake who's currently in Standard, and another Drake that likes instants and sorceries. Pteramander's most popular home in Standard is in mono blue aggro, a deck that seeks to win the game as quickly as possible with evasive damage, and happens to run enough instants and sorceries to adapt Pteramander into a monster in the later part of the game. It also sees play in both Is It Phoenix and Is It Drakes, both decks that are filled to the brim with instants and sorceries. Pteramander will continue to put up points while it's in Standard, and it'll be interesting to see how high it can be on this list by the time that it rotates. And at number 2, we have the last Drake to make the list that is currently in Standard, and that's Crackling Drake. This is an incredibly strong card. It's a lot like Enigma Drake, which we looked at earlier, except that it draws you a card and counts cards that have been exiled towards its power, and that last part is important in decks that are running cards with Jumpstart and other effects that exile cards. The fact it draws you a card is great too, meaning that no matter what, even if it dies right away, Crackling Drake has at least replaced itself. The one thing it has against it is its difficult mana cost, but in decks that only run blue and red, paying the mana for Crackling Drake isn't that difficult. In Standard, it is played in both blue-red spell variants out there, Is It Drakes and Is It Phoenix, 2 very similar decks, both of which are in the top tier of the format right now. What has really pushed Crackling Drake to number 2 on this list already, though, is that it is also seeing a lot of play in Modern right now, in that format's version of Is It Phoenix, a deck which plays a ton of cheap spells and discards cards in order to quickly bring Arclight Phoenix back from the graveyard, a strategy that also works to make Crackling Drake massive. Crackling Drake is going to continue to add to its score. It managed a top 8 at Mythic Championship London just last weekend, so while it isn't number 1 right now, I think it will be there soon. And at number 1 we have Gilded Drake, a Drake that usually doesn't actually stay on your side of the battlefield. While it has impressive stats for the cost, you're going to be handing Gilded Drake over to your opponent. However, in exchange for that, you get to take their best creature, and there are plenty of board states where you'd rather give your opponent a 2-mana 3/3 flyer than whatever their best creature is. You can also then bounce the Drake and do it all over again if that comes up. It didn't see play in Standard or Block, but did see a lot of play in extended sideboards. It was mostly relegated to sideboards because of the fact that a card like this isn't going to be very good against aggro decks, for example. Generally, you're going to be getting a worse creature than the Drake is against them. However, it is great against decks that go big with creatures, and it even saw some mainboard play as a one of in Extended, where it could be tutored up by survival of the fittest in situations where the Drake would be at its most powerful. It didn't see any play between 2005 and 2012, but in 2012 it had a resurgence in Legacy, where it is a particularly powerful card against decks that like to cheat creatures into play with Reanimation or Show and Tell, since you get their Gristlebrand, in exchange for the 3/3. However, it hasn't seen play there since 2015, though I can't imagine it finding its way into decks in the format in the future, if decks using those cheat a creature into play strategies become a larger part of the metagame. If it doesn't find a home in Eternal format soon, I think Crackling Drake will be passing it. Well, that does it for this week's MTG Top 10. If you enjoyed this video, do me a favor and like it and share it so others can enjoy it too. Starting next week, and at the very least lasting for the next few months, I will actually be doing 2 MTG Top 10s a week. There will be one on Wednesdays as well as the ones on the usual Fridays. If you want to make sure you catch MTG Top 10s in the future, don't forget to subscribe, and if you want to see the MTG Top 10s from the past, you should see the playlist on your screen now. Thanks for watching.